I've often heard this music in my mind when I'm about to read. A yellow shape moves in the dark. It's round and bulbous with a dark line splitting it up the middle. It twists and wriggles and swings gently in a pendulum motion. I don't know what it is, but it entices and seduces me. It feels like a symbol of everything I want. The camera backs away and Marnie in Mull's suit and wig walks along a train platform. The angles of the chrome awning, the vectors of the tracks, all point toward her. The shape is a satchel held under her arm. We'll learn it holds stolen money. Laurie has asked me to see Hitchcock's Marnie with her at an art house in Hudson on a Saturday night. I have other obligations, but I push them aside. Laurie's like a bus going by that I occasionally grab onto and skitch behind. She's in constant motion. She whooshes in and out of town. She brings a veneer of freedom and irresponsibility into my life. The Hudson night is black and damp. White slicks of reflected light gash the streets. Bars and restaurants are lit up, but there's no one on the sidewalks, no signs of life, just hints from bright windows. I turn into the gravel parking lot of TSL, a hulking industrial building on a side street away from the main action in town. At the top of wooden steps, I push open a heavy warehouse door into an empty hallway painted Kubrick white. Photographs line the walls, beaming children, adults in costumes and makeup, clowns, actors, opera singers. At the end of the hallway, I turn a corner and a din comes up like someone flicked a switch. People stand in small throngs, men in designer shoes, women in scarves, mostly older, dressed in black or gray. City people, weekenders, a few permanent evacuees. Laurie is situated in conversation. She's talking about John Epperson, AKA Lipsinka, the drag queen who will introduce the film. She used to watch him perform in the 80s and 90s. I remember Lipsinka from my New York days, but I never saw him. Back then, instead of watching gay men unveil their femininity in cabarets, I was watching straight men ramp up their masculinity in CBGBs. Back then, cultural groups were distinct, but decades later, upstate, we're all thrown together. One of the men in Laurie's group runs a small press fair in Hudson every spring, followed by a reading with big-name novelists and poets. I run a sales table at the event for the local bookstore. I say hello to him, and he takes a moment to register me out of context. Hudson's like that. We're all someone else during the day, during the week, or we were before we moved up here. Else's. The room tips. People roll like little balls from one side to another. We siphon into the screening room and take our seats. Epperson, out of drag, is a plain man with a pale complexion and short, sandy hair. He wears jeans and an untucked plaid shirt. He looks like a corn-fed Midwestern boy and talks in an unemotive drawl. Pay special attention to the opening sequence, he instructs, showing Marnie on the train platform. Her satchel looks like a vagina. The lights go down. I slide into another time, another identity. In the late 80s, when I first lived in New York, friends and I would duck into the Talia or the Quad, scum-encrusted Lower East Side revival houses with creaky black seats and ghouls at the concession stand. Back then, you couldn't touch-dial movies onto your phone or voice command them onto your TV. You had to pursue them, catch them. You read tiny vertical newspaper ads with blurry print. You built your life around The Little Fugitive on a Tuesday at the Public or Cocksucker Blues at Anthology in December. Once you got there, you didn't have to operate the hardware or troubleshoot if it broke. You just sat and waited to be done to, while some guy, nerdy, probably stoned, overqualified, a scholar, pulled levers in an image-firing cubby behind your head. The feeling of being somewhere else, someone else, is intoxicating. It's wonderful how we respect the imminence of film, how in the anticipating darkness we hold our breath and don't fidget. I forget Laurie's next to me, forget that any of us are any of us. All skulls point toward the screen. All life forms in the room participate in this obedience. Soon Hitchcock's cool blue palette will project all over us. I love the film. I love Tippi Hedren's squeaky voice and angry scratching hands. I live every moment in Marnie's skin. I feel like her when she lays her head in the lap of the mother who rejects her. The mother loves Marnie, but is so distorted by choices in her past that she recoils when Marnie comes near. I feel like her in the scene where she submits to sex with Sean Connery. I see the helplessness in his desire. He's in love with Marnie. Vulnerability slackens the muscles in his face as he holds her. She twists and writhes away from him in terror, but suddenly she freezes. He tugs at her robe and she backs onto the bed, glassy and numb. Hitchcock's lighting is a shroud. The room dissolves into blue, gray, green shadows, travel colors, hotel colors, suitcase colors. All we see are Hedren's pinprick eyes, unnaturally bright, ghost eyes, animal eyes. No soul eyes. Then the camera cuts to a porthole window and he has her. When I met Laurie, I was a housewife. Needing an outlet, I enrolled in a writing workshop with her and wrote a piece about a woman in bed next to her husband, trying not to move or breathe too loudly. Her life was a series of pent-in nights, lying frozen in order to avoid having sex with someone she no longer desired. What kept her going on these nights of unmotion was thinking back on her former city existence. Guitar players mangling chords in clotted club air, damp mattresses in grimy Alphabet City walk-ups with delirious drug sniffers while the moon shone hot and full between rooftop water towers. As I read the piece, Laurie's large, attentive eyes grew larger and more attentive. I could see her forming opinions, turning them over, testing them. After the workshop, she took me aside. "Where did that piece come from?" she asked. "I've been throwing writing like that away my whole life," I said. "That has to stop," she said. Laurie rescued me. The woman in the story left her marriage and claustrophobic Toontown and came to Hudson. She began working in a bar bookstore. She landed a show on a local radio station. She joined a band. Each of these new identities felt magical. Each felt like a disguise. I love Marnie because I know her story. Marnie is a thief who becomes a sedate housewife. I used to be a housewife, but I escaped. The room tips again, pouring us back into the reception area. A buffet has been laid, roast beef, tea, sandwiches, potato and mushroom caps in hot trays. Laurie and I load up small plates. We stand together, not talking. Her eyes are furtive, scanning the room. She's curious about who these people are. She's got a thing about Hudson and its escapees. I ask what she thought of the film. She holds a sandwich firmly in her fingers. When she eats, she eats. Laurie never equivocates. It didn't interest me, she says with a shrug. It didn't have much to offer me. Laurie is writing her own story of the evening. I wonder which version of me will be in it, if it's one I'll recognize. I wonder if my version of her, mentor, liberator, is one that she'll agree with. I wonder if our friendship is a parallel fiction. TSL's windows have been bricked over to enclose the theater. I think about the long hallway that leads back to the parking lot, to the wet streets, to a darkness punctured by other doorways, other entrances. We're not fixed or frozen. We don't have to be afraid to move or breathe. Each of us has an escape. Thank you very much.
I suggest to Karen we see Marnie. John Epperson, the great female impersonator, is going to introduce it in Hudson, and Hudson is where Karen and I spend time together. She says, "Great, what a good idea." She is an agreeable person, so how can you know what she really feels? I used to take people at their word, but since I started living with an English person, I have become suspicious of charm and good manners. In their affability, English people are female impersonators. The movie is screened in Time and Space Limited, a great factory turned into an art space. Little roast beef sandwiches and mushroom duxelle and pastry shells are laid out on a table, and there is wine at a bar. TSL is the kind of place that makes you think you can leave New York and live in someone else's life. You imagine a place so quiet you can hear snow mound, and it sounds like a letter dropping through a slot. The smell of deer reminds you of old minks stored in attics under pearl-colored dust. You look at the sharp little teeth around the edges of leaves, and it feels like being drunk all the time. Nothing nagging. Karen is wearing pants the color of smoked salmon and a pale green cotton jersey. She looks happy. She bends to kiss me, and I remember how short I am and how disappointing that is. A man I once lived with said ponies were mean because they resented their size. Every day, I have to remind myself to like something. I like Hitchcock's anxious, tangled-up women, and that no one is happy in his films. I remember seeing Marnie in 1964 and feeling vaguely let down. Maybe I didn't want the heroine to chuck her life of crime and espionage being havens from domesticity. On Homeland right now, Carrie Mathison would rather get shot than give her infant daughter a bath. I had also found Marnie compelling. Something about Tippi Hedren's gasping delivery and her forehead, which was large enough to project a movie onto. Hitchcock understands the bleak sweatiness, the lurching, wide-eyed, dead-eyed swings of entrapment. Hedren plays a woman termed frigid and a kleptomaniac. The words frigid and kleptomaniac harken back to the heady days of Freudian chic, when people seasoned conversations with quotes from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Sean Connery falls in love with Marnie, even though she cannot stand to be touched. He blackmails her into marrying him and sets about sorting out her past. It makes you think about whether all marriages involve blackmail. My one marriage, which took place 2 years after Marnie was released, involved blackmail in that my father agreed to sign the lease on an apartment my boyfriend and I wanted to move into if I would marry my boyfriend. I said, "Great, what a good idea." Watching Marnie, I thought the best line was the last line, when Marnie says to Sean Connery, "I'd rather be married to you than in jail." The point being, well, you see the point. I used to think no one wanted power. It was too much responsibility. Secretly, people wanted to be stopped. Secretly, everyone was a bottom. Then I considered this was probably something a woman would think up. Throughout the film, Marnie is working out her relationship to power. Her mother is strangely rejecting, and we don't know why until the climax, when we learn she was a prostitute, and 6-year-old Marnie killed one of her Johns. The John, played by a young, not-so-toothy Bruce Dern in a sailor suit, was also groping Marnie, and she struck him with a poker. There is blood. Marnie comes to fear the color red and eventually becomes a thief, of course. She changes identities, fanning out fake Social Security cards. I wondered if it was hard to get fake Social Security cards. Who has not at some point felt stuck in a life they wanted to ditch? Who does not dream of going to sleep and waking up with a new identity? This once happened to me, and the new identity instructed a famous poet about how to make chicken soup. The new identity said, "You need stock. You can't make soup with water and vegetables and chicken. You need bouillon at least and herbs." The famous poet just stared. The most disturbing part of Marnie is where Sean Connery's character forces himself sexually on Marnie. It is a complicated scene, partly because Connery is a walking piece of sex, and part of the frustration of the film builds, is denying this man erotic success. Marnie does not fight him off, but the next day she tries to drown herself. 2 writers quit working on the screenplay, unable to convince Hitchcock to cut the scene, explaining the audience would lose sympathy with the male lead. Hitchcock, who had escaped the poignant bitterness of his obesity in Thin as Air celluloid, delighted in the grisly comedy of fleshly existence. Famously obsessed with Hedron, though, he wanted to see her humiliated, and he sacrificed his art to a personal thrill. At this point, the movie comes off like an unprotected child sent to camp with all the wrong clothes and with no one caring about the ridicule the child will stir up. After the screening, Karen asks what I thought. I shrug and say, "It got tiring. The sexual weirdness has left a bad taste, and I have forgotten to like something." She says she lived every moment. She is doing the shiny, radiant thing she does with her eyes, as if she has fallen in love with the movie, and I am hurting the thing she loves. I feel like a man in a cafe with a clump of foam caught on his mustache that no one has the energy to wipe off. The first time I met Karen, she read aloud a story. In the first part, a young woman wakes up in the apartment of a skinny guitar player with black, spiky hair. The sheets smell of dried sweat and have the sheen of too long a time without washing. He invites her to snort something, and she excites herself with the thought of being in such a moment. The guitarist reads poetry, of course. He reads Rimbaud and Baudelaire. The young woman can't believe he finds her sexy and smart. In the next scene, which takes place 10 years later, or the next day in the mind of the girl woman, she is with her husband, and she has been married for 10 years. Her husband wants sex, and she gives in, fearing the pricklier consequences of saying no. She can see in his eyes her reluctance hurts him, and that he turns the hurt into entitlement. She can see it all. When he tells her not to hang a photograph she has bought of a lonely road on the wall of their bathroom, she puts the photograph in a drawer. He doesn't like her to buy steak for company. Hamburger is good enough. She doesn't wonder why she is with him, and we are not sure if the husband was once the rocker or the man meant to save her from the rocker. After she finished, I thought of Raymond Queneau's remark that imaginary stories deal with love and true stories deal with hunger. I wasn't sure if Karen knew how good she was. I told her as we stood beside a piano. Slabs of gray hair curtained her face. Her lips were full and symmetrical, like the wings of a small moth. Her moth lips parted in pleasure. After the movie, she says, "Let's walk," and we head down Warren Street to a posh restaurant. She has a crush on a chef who works there and who flirts with her at the Spotty Dog, where she tends bar and manages the bookstore. She also hosts a radio show and does vocals in a band. Every few feet, someone calls her name or stops to chat. A guy with a crooked grin says, "Hey, rock star," and it strikes me she has become the skinny rocker she once slept with. She says the chef brought her a slice of pizza. Does that mean something, she asks? How can she not know? I say, in flirting, a pizza is the equivalent of marriage. She laughs. At the restaurant, the chef is spooning a reduction over grilled lamb. Karen holds back. He sees her and flashes a big smile. He is very attractive under his giant beard. When we are seated, I say, "He's beautiful, but not so much the beard." She says, "I love the beard." I think, okay, we won't fight over the same man. We talk about this boy and boys in general, two girls in a town where you can be anyone you want, two girls talking about boys as if they are ours for the taking, and then we talk about Marnie. Thank you.